Welcome to our first video, which is going to provide you with some helpful background information about Genesis chapters 1 to 11. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is actually from a discussion that I led a few years ago and is edited to really provide you with the essential content so that you can really focus in on what to understand and really to see these foundational chapters as they were originally intended by the author. Now, some of the recording was a bit choppy at times, but the content is really good. It originated from Bruce Waltke's Genesis commentary and my seminary training. So let's begin.
Okay, so let's first look at the timeline and the characters. So he breaks this up into really 5 books. I combined the last one because they kind of relate together. But there's a creation story, the introduction, the prologue, 7 days, God created everything. And then it works into Adam, and then his descendants, and then Noah, and then his descendants, and then Abraham. So that's kind of how the book's broken up, or this section's broken up. And really, when I think about Genesis, it's part of a bigger book. So there's a lot of books here, but you could see that Moses wrote the Torah, which are the first 5 books in the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He wrote that together as a way to remind the Jews that their sovereign creator goes with them as they become a new people in a new land. And so they're going to be faced with other people groups that have that profess other gods. And this is the Jewish origin story to remind them of who the true God is. And so think of that as we're reading through this. It's really to prepare the Jews as they become a new people in a new land. The key verse in the Torah is Deuteronomy 31:6. Be strong and courageous, for I will never leave you nor forsake you. I'm your God. Do not be afraid. Do not be terrified of them, the people groups, because I go with you. And so that really frames how we should understand Genesis. And then within Genesis, there's 2 parts, chapters 1 through 11 that we're looking at today, and then chapters 12 through 50. So it goes kind of big, global in the beginning, these first 11 chapters, and then it focuses on one family, Abraham, whose family continues through the rest of the story of Genesis. And another way to frame Genesis is to see how God's goodness will continue. You see that in the beginning, in the creation story that we read, everything was good to God, very good. And then at the very end of Genesis, in Genesis 50, we see with the story of Joseph, who faced real problems, even caused by his own family. And at the end, it says, what you intended for evil, what humanity intended for evil, God worked for good. And so it's just really, from beginning to end, a story about how God accomplishes his good purpose. And so we'll see that even in these first 11 chapters. So that's the timeline character, kind of hitting the high points of how Genesis fits in the Torah, and then how you break down Genesis overall. So we're going to look at these first kind of 5 books together. When you think about plot, the action of the story, if I had to write a kind of a synopsis of the first 11 chapters, this is how I would summarize it. That God created a good world. That's that first chapter. Second chapter, Adam broke it in chapter 3. But Adam, who God created to really care for the garden, he chose to define good and evil for himself. And then sin came out of that disobedience. Now that's the problem in the story. It will continue through the entirety of the Old Testament until we come to Jesus, when he deals with the problem. And so God promised a solution. We're going to see that in chapter 3. Might not have noticed that when you were reading it, but it's a huge point in the story of the Bible that we'll hit. Then we hit some descendants. The world gets worse, doesn't get better. And then Noah, it's so bad that God has to start over with Noah. He preserves Noah, and really, in a sense, preserves the promise. And then the story of his descendants. It didn't fix anything. So now what? So that kind of sets up Abraham. And so let's now break into these creation stories. So the prologue. So this announces, again, that the God of the covenant community, the Jewish people, is the same God who's the creator of everything. Think about how that would make you feel. It's kind of like your big brother who's in school, and you go into school and you feel kind of nervous about being in school, and then he's been there, done that. Trust me, don't be afraid, I go with you. So God's the creator. He's making provision, he's establishing order, and he's commissioning mankind. And so it's really setting the stage for the rest of the story, the drama that's going to unfold for all of human history. And really in this chapter, it's that God, in verse 1, he spoke and it all came into being. So that's the creation story, technically, verse 1. And then he brings order out of chaos. So then the rest of the chapter is him forming those things that he created into purposeful use for his creation. So he forms the days. So he doesn't just have matter. There's time. There's purpose with the animals and mankind. And so God brings order out of chaos. Those who submit to him, they'll find light. Out of the darkness, they'll find order. And then day 6 is really the climax. That's creation of mankind. And when it says that he's made in the image of God, that's really bringing highlight to a really unique aspect of humanity, that we represent God, who's king. And we're kind of like little kings, and we represent his image. But really, the first book is to make the point, God's in charge. He's sovereign. And as the Jews are reading this, is to know that his teachings in scripture, in the Torah, harmonize with moral order. So what they're called to live out as the Jews, that we're going to see later on in the rest of the Torah, that harmonizes with his creation. And I like this statement, all truth is God's truth. That's really what it's saying. It's all God's truth, and it all shapes who we are. Story Adam, the first human, and chapters 2:4 to 4:26. So that's the next book. I actually had a good question from Albert. He was asking, why is there 2 creation stories? Or, why is chapter 1 different from chapter 2? And it's really to kind of refocus the creation story through the first human, Adam. So it's a second creation story. And there's really 3 parts to this book. There's a part of Adam in chapter 2, sin in chapter 3, and then the consequence of sin. And what's interesting, as you kind of read through this, pay attention to when you see poetry. There's some poetic comments in 2:23, in Genesis 2:23. That's where it says, this is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, she shall become woman. It's kind of bringing attention to that. 3:14 to 19, that's when the Lord said to the serpent. There's some poetic conversation there. And then 4:23 to 24, it's also a little poetic conversation. And then there's closing comments. So that kind of helps shape what's the kind of breakout of this timeline. But it's really, the significance is it moves from God as a sole actor to humanity. So now humanity is on stage, and it moves from a very drastic change from very good to now the hardship of life outside the garden. So interesting to think about, like, God created the whole world, and then he had a garden in that world. We're not allowed in that garden. And it was in that garden that he was this priestly guardian of the temple. So there's a real sense that he's created to care for creation, that worships God. And so God gave a real purpose to Adam. He breathed life into him. He became an ensouled being. And then unfortunately, Adam, in response to that gift, used his authority to decide what's evil and good for himself. And so good got twisted. He was tested for faithfulness, and he failed. And it really starts to point to our need for God's help. So it was through Adam's disobedience that sin entered the world and led to death. That's what happened. And all of creation's now become cursed. And then we see this escalation of sin. It's moving from deception with Adam and Eve to now murder. I mean, that's a pretty big jump. I can struggle telling the truth, but man, to kill someone, wow, that's how bad it's getting. So I want you to see that drastic change, because as we get to Noah, you might wonder, like, wow, why is God that angry to start over? Well, I think to go from telling lies to killing people, that's a big jump. That's how fast sin is really taking over. And so, wonder why Cain and Abel, Cain kills Abel, right? Yeah. So Cain brought some of his produce as tribute to God. It wasn't because, Abel had an animal that he was better. It was that the way that it's written is that Cain didn't bring a full tribute to God. And so that's why God honored Abel's gift, because he brought the best. And so I think that's the first murder, and really to highlight that humanity has a problem in need of God's graceful redemption. So that's really the next story, highlighting we had a purpose to rule the world, but then we chose to define good and evil for ourselves that result in sin, brokenness. And so now we got to deal with it. Now here's when you think about, just one thing I want to highlight, and because this really, when you think about the story of the Bible, so I'll step back, not get lost in the details. I don't know if you caught this, but who's the wounded victor promised in Genesis 3? I will put enmity between you and the woman. This is God speaking to the woman after sin. So sin just happened. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring, your seed. We talked about that, Galatians, your seed and her offspring, your offspring. So that's talking to
the woman.
Yeah. So he will bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. What's that talking about? Who's being, I guess in a sense, prophetically, sought now? And it really started to create expectation for a savior. This is where, I don't know, in seminary they try to create all these fancy words. You might have heard of it, the proto-evangelion. It's this idea of the first note, the first moment of redemption, of God's intention to bring salvation, right when sin happened. God could have destroyed his creation, and he didn't. He promised a savior. That's what he's saying here, that this serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between the serpent's offspring and the woman's offspring. He shall bruise your head, talking to the serpent, and you, the serpent, shall bruise his heel. Well, that's a picture of Christ.
Yeah.
That there's a cost that's going to happen, and this prophetic expectation now, is going to really shape this story. And so it's really say that right from the beginning, God had a promise to really deal with sin, and it's going to require a cost, and ultimately Jesus is going to make good on the debt that we owe for our sin. So that's really important for you to see. It's really the first unanswered question that we're going to read in the Torah. And as a way to understand what we're reading is to really see that that the Old Testament really presents questions that find answers in Jesus. And so this is the first question that, as the Jews are reading this, they're going to be like, who's that? Who's going to be this, bruise your head, bruise his heel? Who's the wounded healer? So we have Adam's descendants here. So this is going from Adam to Noah. And now, again, like the question that's going to be on the Jewish reader is, who's this seed that's coming, that's going to rule the earth, who's going to crush the serpent? And so what I love about chapter 5 is that the first thing that happens is there's a revisiting of God creating man in his image. And so even though sin came into the world, it does not mean that we don't represent God. It's just that we're a distorted image bearer. We still have purpose. And sin, though, is there, and there's a progressive, rapid hardening of sin that's too strong for mankind. You really see it in chapter 6, verse 5, which is setting up Noah. It says that the Lord saw. Now, notice that he was there. He was a part of it. He didn't just hear about it. He saw that the wickedness, so it's wicked, it's growing, of man was great on the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So I think we need to understand as we go into Noah that the earth wasn't just getting kind of bad, it was getting like judgmentally bad. Like it was so bad it grieved God's heart. It says the Lord was sorry. It actually means that he changed his mind. That's how it's literally written. And we'll talk about that later. God was sorry that he had made man on the earth. It grieved him to his heart. I mean, that shows his personality, that shows his love. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, and all of creation with him. Verse 8. Now remember, the end of the story is so important. That's the conclusion should really shape our understanding of what this book is about. It says, but, verse 8, Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, which is meaning that this seed that they're looking for now from chapter 3, that there's hope, that there's still a future. And so Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, and then that's why we then transition to Noah. So, this transition part is really highlighting mankind as a way to set up Noah. So let's go into Noah next. So Noah's family. All right, so chapter 6, 9, verse 9 through 9:12. Noah and his family is in the middle of Adam and the call to Abraham. That's we're going to get to in chapter 12. So it's pivotal. It slows down, and it really is to say that God's actions speak for themselves. He's going to both unleash the flood on time and spare Noah on time. And this is where we get introduced to the covenant, this idea of God making a commitment with humanity. God is the most repeated covenant maker in the Bible, and this is the first formal covenant. And what's significant is that God relied on Noah to build the ark. If he didn't do that, what would have happened? I don't know. That's a question I don't know the answer to, but the point is Noah did everything that God commanded him, and this is what's good and hard. This is a conflicted hero story. Noah in part 1 is the righteous hero who preserves humanity, and then part 2, that kind of is brief at the end, features Noah as the drunken sinner who leads to a division of humanity. And then you actually start to see some of the mention of the people groups that the Jewish people are going to be encountering in Canaan. It's foreshadowing, at this point, looking ahead to where the Jews were moving in, and there's this curse laid in Canaan, and Seth and Japheth are blessed. Now, to find the key verse of this section, I mentioned that sometimes when we interpret the story, that the author can use kind of poetic elements. This is definitely narrative, and yet the way that it's communicated at times is through kind of poetic ideas of shaping the story. And so chapter 8, verse 1 is the most important verse of the whole section of Noah. So people love, maybe the dramatic moment of what happened with the flood, but the key of this is God remembered Noah. That's what's the author wants you to know, and I'll show how we know that in a second. There's this chiastic structure, and so if you ever want to break this down, we mentioned this last class where there's kind of the beginning and the end, and then the second story to the second to the last story, B, third story to third to the last story, C, fourth story to fourth to the last story, D, E, F, and X. God remembers Noah. It's to really highlight, as you're thinking through, what does the author want me to know? That's it, is chapter 8, verse 1. God remembers Noah. He's faithful. His promise is stronger than the corruption of the world. His promise is stronger than the corruption of the world. So even though things are getting bad, God is faithful. And so God makes this commitment, and humanity is preserved by God, and Noah being participant with that commitment. And so I think we'll look at covenants as well. But in 6:18, God makes his first covenant to preserve him, and then 9:9 with humanity, never again to destroy the earth. That's with the rainbow. Something else I just want to highlight is, this is kind of interesting, especially if you've been reading the Bible for a while, you might not have noticed this, is that there's a subtle theme of recreation after the flood. And so God follows through on the consequence of sin. And so what's beautiful, though, is after the flood, you start to see kind of a revisiting of chapter 1. So chapter 1 being the creation story, God's spirit hovers over the waters. And then look at this recreation of life with Noah. God sends a wind. And then phase 2, you'll see in the creation story, he divides the water. And then 8:2, he regathers the water. And what's important is you'll see that this is sequential. So that's why it really brings attention to this parallel connection. In the creation narrative in chapter 1, he then separates the dry ground. In 8:3, the mountains appear. Phase 4, the sky opens up with birds, the raven and the dove appears, the living creatures come out, and then it really gets obvious in phase 6, male and female, Noah and his wife, image of God, and then be fruitful, be blessed. And so there's definitely a connection to the creation story here. God declared again with purpose for Noah that he's the image of God, to be fruitful and multiply. God's committed to humanity's purpose and love. He loves humanity, wants to work with humanity. And then after all of this good stuff happens, there's the unfortunate ending where part 2, it's a reminder that conclusions matter. That's in chapter 9, right before the Descendants. He blesses them. He has a covenant with them. And where did let's see here. The sons of Noah who went forth. Yep, he began to work. So I'm in chapter 9, verse 21. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness. So that might communicate to you like, oh, he just, accidental. It wasn't accidental. It actually, the way the word is used, it's a searching, it's a wanting to see him naked, it's voyeurism. And so because of that, the curse continues. And you see that specific with Ham, who's the father of ultimately Canaan. And that's the land where the Jews are going to go. So it's kind of foreshadowing ahead. And then again, the last scene, Noah lived and then he died. And so sin's consequence continues. And so that needs to be dealt with. And so this is, a really popular kids story that is a really hard one for me. I go to my kids' school and you see the happy animals on an ark. And it's like the backdrop is of like judgment on all of humanity. So, it's a really hard story for me. But the biggest thing you guys got to see with Noah is God's promise is stronger than the corruption in the world. His promise endures. And that's where it's that covenant in there. And we'll talk about covenant as well. But Noah is a huge pivotal moment for us in humanity, and grateful for him. So Descendants. So God's blessing results in Noah's son multiplying, but his curse results in them being scattered. So you see the blessing and the cursing happening. Ham's descendants include Israel's bitter enemies like Egypt, Philistia, Assyria, Babylon. So it's kind of setting up the Jews to say, like, there's a story behind the people that are going to be removed from the promised land. Noah's righteousness, his sense of goodness is reproduced in Shem and Japheth. there's some man's responsibility, God's sovereignty here that we have to work through that tension, that we have a responsibility and God's orchestrating. And so it's a both and. But as we start to work through this last section before Abraham, again, there's a contrast to the creation story that we started to see in, chapter 8. Well, and then it's interesting, the genealogy of 10, he's talking about people groups, which is really unique. And so God is not just sovereign over all creation, he's sovereign over all people groups, which then ties into Babel, where Satan and sin promote division. And then what happened there, God came down. It speaks of his providence, his engagement in humanity's problems. They didn't expect him to come down. And, in spite of their rebellion to try to build this city, which is kind of highlighting technology as well, which there's some, shared truths that we can work through. And, the brick at that point was like technologically advanced. And think about today, but they use that technology to live contrary to God. And yet God still fulfilled his design that people be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. That's what God wanted. And they were disobeying that. They wanted to become great for themselves. It really highlights humanity's pride and results in division in our world. And yet, book 5, which is that last kind of genealogy leading to Abraham, you really see that God's people will be a means of blessing. And so that really highlights, the people that will lead up to Abraham and ultimately to God's people and Jesus. God's people are put there to be a blessing. And so as we look at this, I want to just highlight, though, just as we did with Noah, this is again that chiastic structure. So when you look at, if I were to do a sermon on Babel, the part I would hammer is the Lord came down, because he uses chiastic, this poetic element, to really shape the story. The parallels in the beginning A to the end A hyphen, or with that apostrophe. The second story B with the second to last story, you kind of see my point. The Lord came down is the most important point. And I think that really highlights just how our God's involved. Even as the world is falling apart, God's there. And so he's sovereign over all the nations of the world. His promised seed will come. His purpose will be accomplished. He's involved. And so that's how we finish with this as a backdrop to, Abraham. Shem's descendants lead to Abraham. These image bearers of God, these rulers in the sense of God's creation, the seed's coming, and the seed will destroy the serpent.